So by now you should have been able to broadly define the topic area that you found a debate, you forecasted that there are citations, there's activity in that area, and you're really passionate about it. What we're going to do now is really start to optimize the feasibility of your topic. And to do so, we're going to use a PICO model. A PICO model that's worked for a lot of my students to help make sure their topic's really well defined. And it's going to help keep you oriented so you don't get lost as you go through your review. So it's really going to make sure everything is crisp, clean, tightly organized, and this model is really going to be a guide. By the end of the session, I'm going to want you to be able to make a linking sentence that connects the components of your PICO, and that's going to define crisply the topic for your systematic review. We're going to come back to it again and again. It's going to be really important when we get to actually doing our search. So let me go ahead and share a whiteboard, and we'll start defining your PICO model. So PICO, just like it sounds, has 4 main elements. Sometimes there is a fifth, a T, that I'll come to in a second. So let's take each one by one. So population. So many of you are going to have topics that involve certain populations, certain groups or institutions that you want to study. This population could be a group of certain types of patients, maybe patients with diabetes or HIV. It could be a certain kind of firms. Maybe you want small firms. It could be certain populations. It could be certain countries or geographies. Maybe you only want to look in developing countries, for example. So some of you will have a specific population in mind. Maybe you don't. That's also okay. I'm going to erase that, but one element you're going to want to define for your topic is which population are you looking at. The second is intervention. And this intervention, I don't want you to get confused with the terminology, but basically is kind of the independent variable or exposure variable that you're looking at. You know, a lot of topics are going to follow a simple template where you have X causes Y. And almost all of your topics are going to have some X that's linked to some Y. I don't want you to be too exploratory because then you could just expand infinitely and it can get very, very complicated. This intervention is this X, and this can sometimes be defined as the exposure, or it can be the left-hand side. Different fields have different terminologies for this, the independent variable or the intervention. So again, I don't want you to get stuck on the terminology, but if you think about your topic, you're thinking, okay, participating in sports increases the risk of an eating disorder, right? The thing that's increasing the risk or affecting something else, that is the X, that is your intervention or exposure. So that's what you're going to put for this component of your PICO. The next thing is a comparison. And this is important in all research. You might not have this tightly defined in your topic, and that's okay. But sometimes when people are doing literature reviews, they want to compare something to something else. And implicitly, when you're saying, well, I think that blood pressure increases the risk of heart disease, you're saying that you think, well, high blood pressure is a risk. Your comparison is against low blood pressure. You may not have this defined, but I want you to already go ahead and think about it and see what would a comparison group be? What would be the alternative scenario? This is sometimes also called a counterfactual. And many research projects will answer this question. What would have happened if this exposure or intervention was not in place? So think about this. It's not strictly necessary to have, but it will help give you clarity. The next component of the PICO is the outcome. This is a critical variable, and this is your Y. And just to say, the two that are absolutely critical to have thought very hard about are the intervention and the outcome, your X and Y. These are, in a way, indispensable. So your outcome is really going to be, how do you know if there's an effect? What are you looking at? Is this an outcome? Could be, for example, the performance of your firms. It could be an improvement in health and well-being. You want to get this outcome defined as neatly and tightly as possible. Now, sometimes some of you will have an outcome that's maybe a concept. For example, if I want to see the impact on well-being, and maybe you want to disaggregate well-being into physical and mental well-being. That's okay. You just want to make sure you've defined that in a clear way. Maybe you want to look at educational improvement. So maybe you want to look at a composition of outcomes. So grades, better grades, or maybe better test results, or lower dropout rates. The point is you need to be very crisp and clear on how you're going to define these outcomes, because that's going to come later in the topic. One thing I do want to point out as with these outcomes is it's also sometimes the why. So this can sometimes be the exposure, the outcome, the independent, the dependent variable, the left-hand side, the right-hand side. Sorry for my bad handwriting. Right-hand side. Don't get too hung up on this. I just want you to think about your topic. What is affecting what? When you have this in place with your PICO, you've defined all these components. You're then going to be ready to make a linking sentence. And let me give you a concrete example. So suppose I'm interested in, for example, how poverty might lead people with HIV to have worse treatment. And the treatment's just not as effective for poor people compared with rich people. Now I've got a nice PICO because my population would be HIV patients. My intervention would be looking at being exposed to poverty. My comparison would be people not in poverty, or maybe wealthier groups. And my outcome would be, well, how do they respond to treatment? So it could just be treatment outcomes, which I might further define in a more crisp biological way of maybe immune cell counts or other things. Don't want to go in detail on medical side, but you want to see each of these components. Once you have these components in place, you can then begin to make your linking sentence. So in this case, I would be interested in the negative impact of poverty on HIV treatment outcomes. So you should be able to construct a sentence that brings together the main components of your PICO, and so that anybody can look at this and be like, I understand completely what you're doing. So usually what you're going to have are you're going to have some main nouns in your sentence, and these main nouns are going to come from your PICO, and then you're going to link them with verbs that are going to describe the relationship. So maybe the kind of word here that's describing the relationship between the PICO components is the impact on. So I hope this begins to help you. It's really important to make a PICO linking sentence. I'm going to do one more example just to make everything clear for you. So let's say my interest here is in climate change. And I'm very interested in how climate change is going to impact on migration in developing countries. So here we go. I have developing countries as my population. My intervention, I'm looking at climate change. And you may want to define this. Maybe you want to look at environmental events associated with climate change. Comparison group is going to be no climate change, hypothetically. And the outcome that we're going to be looking at is migration. Okay, so here we go. We think, again, that climate change could increase migration rates. So we'll look at, say, the impact or effect of climate change on migration in developing countries. That's a neatly defined topic that you can then take forward. One thing I do want to point out, sometimes you may have a topic where you're actually looking for an element of the PICO that you don't know in advance what it's going to be. Maybe you want to say, okay, I'm actually looking for what interventions are available and what are their effectiveness that can help achieve an outcome. So let's say you have an outcome like improving physical activity in kids. So you have physical activity in children. And you actually don't know, you want to look for the interventions. That can be okay. That can be okay. So what you would end up having here is they say the effectiveness, to make your PICO linking sentence, effectiveness of alternative interventions, to improve. You want to look at improve. I'm going to abbreviate this, physical activity in children. And what you're probably going to want to do in this is maybe certain types of interventions, you could reduce the space. Maybe it's a digital intervention. You want to look at wearables Maybe you don't have full specificity, you want to look at this, but you can still define it in a tighter way. Maybe children, you want to be specific. Maybe you only want early childhood, or you want teenagers or university students. You really have to define what population or age range to be very specific, because that's going to carry over to the next steps. So I really want you guys to go through and think for yourself, okay, what are these critical elements of my topic? How can I link, especially this intervention component, to some outcome, and define it clearly? The last thing that's kind of optional as well, and that's T in the model, is the time period. And sometimes you may have a reason that you only want to look at certain dates. Suppose there's a new technology that only became available in the year 2000. That would say that you want to specify your year 2000 or later. This is not a strictly essential criterion, but for some of you, you might have a very good reason why you only want to cover certain time periods. If so, then go ahead and include this T component in your model as well. Okay, go ahead and make sure you complete the worksheet to fill out this PICO, because this PICO and the linking sentence is going to be key as we get to next week and start defining and searching for our keywords. All right, see you then.